secret history of the Kenya Defence Forces KDF, its top generals and commanders.
Have you ever wondered why Raila was not hanged and Ochuka was?
Tribalism.
Actually, we have Kenyans masquerading as generals out there with full uniform, full ranks and the like.
And 3 separate attempts by the military to overthrow the Kenyan government. The Akamba community was the most well-represented tribe in the Kenyan military, but one isolated incident in 1971 would lead to President Jomo Kenyatta removing many Akamba soldiers from the KDF ranks.
Why don't you recruit short people?
Short people are great people, but then there's a criteria that is set, and it's not only to the Kenya Defence Force, it is everywhere. Now, if you are shorter than, and the height, by the way, let me clarify again, for you as a woman to join, you have to be 5 feet and above, okay? If you're a man, you need to be 5 feet 3 inches. Okay?
5'3" minimum.
Exactly, 5'3" minimum. Now the reason, if you come in shorter than 5 feet, there is a possibility that you will not attain the required weight, okay? You'll not be able to attain that. And if you have, more weight than you ought to have, then through training, definitely that you will shrink. Now the danger is here. The weapons that we use, the personal weapons that we have, are about over 4 feet. So you can imagine you standing on parade or going to fight, and the weapon is,
it's taller than
you.
The story takes you through 2 extraordinary happenings that brought permanent changes within the ranks of the Kenya Defence Forces KDF.
I, Commander of the Kenya Army, do swear in the name of the Almighty God.
The first such event was the Army Mutiny, a sort of a military mass disobedience that happened at the Lanet Barracks in Nakuru in the year 1964.
My dear countrymen, last night there was an incident at Lanet camp arising out of an attempt by some soldiers of 11th Battalion of the Kenya Army to defy authority. The action of these soldiers is a grave betrayal of the trust and the confidence given to them by the government and the people of Kenya.
A section of the army, the famous 11th Battalion, decided to go on strike against their superiors, complaining about low wages in the Kenyatta government paid to them, and they were also opposed to being commanded by British soldiers who were still placed in certain places in the army despite independence.
Mheshimiwa Rais na Amiri Jeshi Mkuu wa majeshi yote ya ulinzi kuweza kujiunga nasi mali hapa.
The soldiers invaded the armory and stole weapons, then demanded to get a televised address with the Prime Minister, Jomo Kenyatta. Further, these soldiers would force their way into every tent at the Lanet Barracks, forcing all their fellow military men in those tents to join them in their mutineering efforts. It was in the gun armory inside the barracks that they would finally take fort, all while doubling down on their demand for a face-to-face meeting with the Prime Minister in full watch of television cameras. Almost every soldier present in the barracks was said to join this mutiny, which the national government would later term as a mutiny with the intent to overthrow the regime. Instead of giving in to the Lanet soldiers' demands, Jomo Kenyatta refused to meet them and instead requested for military backup from Britain to crush the mutiny. The British would send in their own special military squad known as the Royal Horse Artillery, which would carry out the operation that overcame the mutineers in the Lanet camp and retook control of the captured armory. Before looking into what happened in that early morning operation in Nakuru, it's worth mentioning that army soldiers in other East African countries that had gained independence from the same British colonizers were also unhappy at that time about the same things: very low wages for the soldiers and lingering colonial commanders in the new republic military ranks. These East African soldiers in Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania had long suffered poor working conditions under colonial governments for many years, but would never dare to complain in fear of punishment back then. However, as the hope and promise of new independent Kenya intensified after the 1961 elections, the underpaid soldiers in the barracks of Kenya Defence Forces would begin to see some light at the end of the tunnel. They believed that Jomo Kenyatta and his new government would come in with much better salaries and working conditions for the soldiers now that they were all part of a new black independent country. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, the first vice president of Kenya, would be the first politician to respond to the welfare of the army, and he saw the danger there that was in neglecting the country's soldiers. Jaramogi Odinga would earlier on sound a warning to the Legislative Council, LegCo, about these dangers of not improving what was paid to the soldiers in the military. Finally, after the LegCo had paved way for a new independent government and parliament, Jaramogi's warnings seemed to convince the Kenyatta parliament, and in the end, the Kenya Defence Forces got a salary increment in the year 1962. However, the rise of cost of living and the new taxes that had been introduced that year meant that this pay rise would not make significant improvement to the lives of the KDF soldiers back then, and therefore, a sense of discontentment continued to hang over the Kenya military even as the country celebrated attaining self-rule of Madaraka Day on the 1st of June 1963. 1964 was the year when the remaining Mau Mau forces, who had not left the forest after the British left, were threatening to start another revolt against Jomo Kenyatta's government from the forest. The Mau Mau remnants, led by General Mwathethe, wanted to be put in charge of the new Kenyan military, but Jomo Kenyatta was not welcome to that idea.
December 16, 1964, general amnesty for all Mau Mau, because their war against the British won Kenya's freedom.
All these events were happening at the same time in the period of the Lanet Barracks army mutiny in the neighboring countries of Uganda and Tanzania, where soldiers had tried similar mutinies. The governments there gave in to their demands of salary increments almost immediately, and the British soldiers who were still within those country military ranks were removed effectively. For example, in Uganda, the government even put the mutineering soldiers in charge of the new army outfit that Uganda formed after the disbandment of the colonial King's African Rifles. Here in Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta picked a different way of dealing with the army mutiny in Lanet. When the soldiers in the Nakuru Armory stood their ground and insisted on meeting Kenyatta himself, the requested backup from the British government was already on its way coming. In the morning of Saturday, 25th of January 1964, found that the members of the elite Royal Horse Artillery had laid siege to the Lanet Army Barracks from every direction, waiting for a signal to move in and attack. Many of the Kenyan mutineering soldiers keeping watch near the perimeter wall were the first to be captured and arrested by the invading British soldiers. Those who tried to run away were forced to surrender or get shot from behind. One young soldier who was a clerk in the Lanet Barracks was among those keeping watch on the perimeter outside the armory, and when he realized that the British army had arrived, he started running towards the armory where the other mutineers were, but the British would shoot him and kill him before he could reach the armory. The dead soldier's name was Private Simon Kiprop, who ended up being the only man to die on that Saturday morning operation. At the same time, on the outside of the Lanet Barracks, the British Royal Horse Artillery soldiers as well as the other Kenyan Defence Forces continued broadcasting through loudspeakers that the mutineers hiding inside the Lanet Barracks would be attacked with full military force were they not to come out immediately with hands held up in the sky. Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta, who would be sworn in as president later that year, stayed in Nairobi following the events in Nakuru closely but remotely. It would appear that the mutineering soldiers of the 11th Battalion had finally managed to get the attention of the head of government, albeit at a great cost to their own military careers. In addition to following the events remotely, Jomo Kenyatta would issue a stern warning to the soldiers via the national radio station. The following is a quote from the broadcast where the Prime Minister issued a warning to the mutineers. Those who participated in the event in Lanet have grossly violated military law and code of conduct, and they must be punished accordingly. They will be dealt with according to martial law. There will be no mercy concerning this, and myself, I have no intention of meeting with them or authorizing any of my ministers to negotiate with them. I warn all our people, regardless of whether you are a soldier, police officer, youth winger, members of parliament, and even citizens, that government will deliver harsh punishment to those who disturb the peace and those betraying Kenya through crime. End of quote. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's broadcast to the country would reach many people, including those who were listening to the small radio that had been carried by mutineering soldiers into the Lanet Barracks armory. The Prime Minister's warning put the fear of death in the hearts of many of these young mutineers, but there were those among them who decided to try and escape from the surrounded camp. This group of 20 soldiers decided they could make it out by continuously shooting at the British and Kenyan forces camping outside, but the Royal Horse Artillery soldiers had better weapons, and therefore all 20 of them were captured alive the moment they left the armory. The remaining mutiny soldiers inside the armory were eventually captured later that Saturday afternoon when the British RHA soldiers forced their way into the barracks using special military vehicles.
Those who took part in the Lanet incidents have bravely broken military discipline and must be dealt with firmly. They will be dealt with according to military law. There will be no compromise on this, and I do not intend to meet them or to allow any of my ministers to negotiate with them. We shall not act out of fear. Last, law and order shall be maintained by the Royal Forces of the Kenya Army and the police. If necessary, we shall call for other help, but this decision shall not be varied.
The events at the Lanet Barracks would happen parallel to similar events taking place in the ruling KANU party and its new government at the time. There, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga's left-leaning faction would clash with the other faction led by Tom Mboya and other Kiambu leaders, among them Njoroge Mungai, Jomo Kenyatta's own cousin. And therefore this conflict would be exacerbated after VP Odinga, being also the Minister for Home Affairs, suggested that the British government had played a secret hand in sponsoring the army mutiny in Lanet, Nakuru. According to Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, members of the British military intelligence who had lingered behind in Kenya after independence are the ones who were sent to instigate this mutiny as their way of coercing President Jomo Kenyatta to ask for backup from the British government to crush the mutiny, just as he would end up doing. All this, Jaramogi said, was aimed at helping Britain regain its lost influence in the new Kenyan government even before Kenya became a republic and Kenyatta president later that December. The future vice president's allegations were strongly opposed by the British army, who would flip the script on Jaramogi and accuse their accuser of plotting to kill Jomo Kenyatta and take over the government. Not a lot of time had passed, and before the end of January 1964, the Kenyatta government started punishing the Lanet mutineers just as Mzee had promised. Military prosecutors divided the Lanet mutineers into three categories. The first group of 99 soldiers was represented by the color red, aka the red group. Their colleagues, 158 of them, were placed in the second category, labeled as the yellow group. The remaining 340 soldiers in that barracks were placed in the green category, which was the group of those considered innocent of planning or participating in the army mutiny. Those 99 soldiers in the red group category were the main suspected masterminds, and 77 among them were low-ranking privates. A third of the soldiers in the red category were court-martialed. The military court proceedings for these suspected soldiers would commence between April and May 1964, and they were charged with mutiny under the Kenyan Military Forces Act. The 158 soldiers put in the yellow group category were not charged with any crime in the courts martial, but because they could no longer be trusted, they were effectively discontinued from the military and ordered to return to their home districts and stay there under constant police supervision. Jomo Kenyatta would disband the entire 11th Battalion Kenya Rifles as the 340 soldiers in the green category got new duties in a new military outfit known as the 1st Battalion Kenya Rifles. In the military cases brought against the suspect, there was not a single black Kenyan with a high enough rank in the military of Kenya at the time to oversee court-martial proceedings, since all the top officers in the Kenyan military had been white British soldiers who were already gone back home. And therefore, for the purpose of the court-martial of the Lanet mutiny suspects, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta was forced to promote to that required rank one Kamba military officer whose name was Joseph Musimi Ndolo, who was the one African soldier with the highest rank in the Kenyan Defense Forces back then, fit enough to be promoted to represent these soldiers in the case. The promotion of Joseph Ndolo to become the military commander at the time was taken as a political blessing, not just to himself but also to his community of the Akamba people. What he did not know was that this appointment would turn out to be a curse. In the proceedings of the Lanet mutiny court-martial, the lawyer representing the accused soldiers, who was a foreigner known as Byron Georgiadis, would even threaten to spill the beans there in court concerning the link that existed between the ongoing conflict in government back then and the Lanet Barracks army mutiny. The threat by the defense lawyer would lead to the newly appointed military boss Joseph Ndolo to chase out the media from the room of the court-martial proceedings on the 28th of April, the same day when one of the soldiers called as a witness in the stand would come to admit that the soldiers who were leading the Lanet mutiny effort had made phone calls to the police and other sections of the military just before starting the mutiny and even during the mutiny itself. In the month that followed the Lanet Barracks army mutiny, a debate would arise about which Kenyan tribes dominated the armed forces, even though the mutiny itself had not been executed by soldiers from any one single tribe. In Parliament, some of the Kano MPs brought recommendations that the Mount Kenya tribes, which had previously been prohibited by colonialists from joining the army, were to be allowed to join in now that the British colonial masters were gone. The bill suggested that these other large tribes join the majority Akamba, Kalenjin and Somali in the army, but it was opposed by a politician known as Ian Mwendwa on the floor of the House, who was an elected member from Ukambani. Honorable Ian Mwendwa stood and proclaimed that Akamba men had only two major occupations in the country that they could follow, and these two occupations were to become livestock farmers or to join the national army at the age of 18. He argued that if the new law was to be passed and larger tribes like the Agikuyu were allowed to join the military in numbers, then there would be a big unemployment crisis among his own people. At the time, the lack of food brought about by the Great Famine of 1965 was just about to begin to bite many Kenyan families. Starting in the month of March 1964, negotiations would be initiated between the governments of Kenya and Britain about how the British troops still in Kenya at the time would be removed from the country and taken back to their country for good. It was agreed that those British troops would leave Kenya by the 12th of December 1964, which would eventually become the historical Jamhuri Day, the day when Kenya became a republic and Jomo Kenyatta president. Before departing, the British military would help set up Kenya Air Force as well as to train the African military officers who would take over Kenya's army leadership. It was also agreed that Kenya's own Navy force would also be established before the December 1964 departure. Therefore, it happened that out of the events of the Lanet Barracks army mutiny, Joseph Ndolo would become Kenya's first black commander of the armed forces, who had inherited that position from his white colonial predecessor, Brigadier A.J. Hade, in an official handover ceremony that happened on the 1st of December 1966. However, the influence of the British within the ranks of the Kenyan military would not come to an end with the exit of Brigadier A.J. Hade, but instead another British man known as Major General Bernard Penfold would stay on as the Chief of all Defense Forces, a rank that was still higher than the rank of Joseph Ndolo. When it got to 1969, Joseph Ndolo was eventually promoted again. He took the rank previously held by Major General Penfold, becoming the Chief of all Defense Forces, properly in charge of all the military forces under Kenyatta now. The iron is that even following the appointment in 1969, the place and position of the Akamba community as the tribe that had the biggest number of representatives in the Kenya military ranks did not get any stronger because President Jomo Kenyatta had already passed the law to allow Mount Kenya people to also join the military ranks in numbers. The chaos and fracas that happened in Kisumu in 1969, where President Jomo Kenyatta was attacked and he ended up arresting Oginga Odinga and other Luo leaders, signaled a new chapter not just in the politics of Kenya, but also in the KDF military politics. The second extraordinary event that completely transformed the history of military operations in Kenya was the failed coup attempt and plot of 1971, a coup that, although not many Kenyans have heard about, was also believed to have been orchestrated by the same army boss, Major General Joseph Ndolo, who was also among the main suspects when the coup plot was uncovered prematurely and thwarted by Jomo Kenyatta's government officials. Some of the deeper reasons that led to the events of the 1971 coup plot would remain hidden until many years later, when the American spy agency CIA would release a formally classified top-secret file concerning that plot. The long-kept CIA secret was declassified in the year 2017, and Kenyan journalists would expose and analyze those historical events afresh. The trouble had started when Major General Joseph Ndolo, CDF, would start complaining about the larger number of people of the Kikuyu tribe who were suddenly being promoted up through military ranks by Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and his men. Further, Major General Ndolo discovered that many of his junior soldiers from the Mount Kenya region were allegedly being invited to take a secret oath of allegiance to their tribe to ensure their loyalties remained with President Jomo Kenyatta and his close associates, as opposed to the untrustworthy military leaders like Ndolo.
Sisi watu wa Kenya tumesimama imara.
Finally, Major General Ndolo would discover that one of the KDF soldiers of the Agikuyu community was being groomed and promoted too quickly every year so as to make him inherit the position of the Chief of Defense Staff, even though the man most suitable to be next in line was a fellow Kamba known as Jackson Mulinge, who was just one rank below Ndolo. Apart from the tribalism accusations tainting the Kenyan military under the first Kenyatta government, Major General Ndolo was not impressed by the decision by some of Kenyatta's own officials, who he would accuse of giving weapons and bullets from the military to civilian groups to help those groups persecute opposition leaders who did not support President Kenyatta's government or some of his friends. All these appeared in the top secret CIA documents from 2017. Concerning the coup plot of 1971, the curtain split open when the plot was discovered and Major General Ndolo was named as the top suspect together with another of his top-ranking government tribesmen, then Chief Justice Kitili Mwendwa.
Atakayecheza na Kenya yetu, atakayecheza na serikali yetu sukumu, sisi tutamponda ponda kama honga kabisa kabisa. Tatu, alafu dunia tutemeke.
Others who were suspected and arrested over the coup plot were the associates of first Vice President Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who had himself been imprisoned by Kenyatta for a whole year before following the Kisumu 1969 event. The appointment of Dr. Njoroge Mungai, Jomo Kenyatta's Kikuyu cousin, to be the new defense minister would also be mentioned as another reason that could have angered the coup plotters and drove them to their scheme. When the coup plot was uncovered, 12 people were sent to prison on the 8th of June 1971. Although he never went to prison himself or even got arrested, Major General Joseph Ndolo would quietly resign a short while after the others had been convicted and sentenced for the coup plot. The general would retreat back to his Vuro home in Makueni County, where he would live until his death in 1984. Another Ukambani man accused of plotting with Major General Ndolo had been Yatta MP Gideon Mutiso, who would even confess in court that he wrote the declaration letter that Major Ndolo would read to Kenyans later after overthrowing the Kenyatta government and seizing power. 1971 was the year that the forces led by Idi Amin Dada had successfully overthrown the regime of Uganda's President Milton Obote. President Obote had been toppled by the army following complaints very similar to those Ndolo and his men had against Jomo Kenyatta in the same period. The nepotism, corruption and tribalism that was taking roots in government after independence and the rampant pilferation of public funds to the benefit of the chosen few were the major reason African governments all around Kenya were being toppled and overthrown by military soldiers. The man who took over the leadership of the Kenya Defence Forces after Ndolo was Major General Jackson Mulinge, born in Kadhiani in the Machakos district. Jackson Mulinge had not been a suspect in the 1971 coup plot investigations. When General Jackson Mulinge was interviewed many years later in 2009, he would admit that Major General Ndolo had approached him in confidence, inviting him to play part in the coup attempt, which Mulinge refused, but he says he did not tell Kenyatta about it. Later it would be Mulinge who convinced President Jomo Kenyatta to forgive Joseph Ndolo for the betrayal, since to arrest the former military boss, Jomo Kenyatta would have been forced to send lower-ranking police or military officers, something that could trigger more rebellion from the soldiers who considered Ndolo to be a great military leader.
Walk us through someone coming into the army, right?
Yes.
What level, what rank do they come in as?
Yes.
And how do you work your way?
Well, Jeff, if you're a commissioned officer, you begin with a second lieutenant at the level of
If
second.
you're commissioned.
If you're commissioned, then you go to lieutenant. That's 1 star is the second lieutenant, 2 stars is lieutenant, 3 stars is captain. If you have this, you're a major, okay? Then the next rank is lieutenant colonel, okay? Then from there you go to colonel. From colonel you go to brigadier, brigadier to major general, then lieutenant general, and finally general. But in other circumstances, you have field marshals. In Kenya, I think that is reserved for the commander-in-chief.
And so it happened that army boss Joseph Ndolo got to be allowed to walk scot-free, even as his fellow coup plotters served jail sentences of varying lengths. The convicts imprisoned in June 1971 would be charged with minor offenses of sedition, an attempt to divide the republic, as opposed to the more serious charges of treason that were punishable by death. During the trial of the 1971 coup plotters, politicians allied to President Jomo Kenyatta would organize their supporters to protest and demonstrate on the streets of Nairobi condemning the coup suspects. In court, the coup plotters were tried in a civilian court, unlike the 1964 Lanet Barracks mutiny soldiers who were tried in a court-martial, for they had all been soldiers. The judge S.K. Sachdeva, who passed out the judgment in the 1971 coup plotters, was told that the coup had been planned in Ukambani, Dar es Salaam city, and also in the Ugandan capital of Kampala. It was reported that the Kamba MP from Yatta, Gideon Mutiso, was the chairperson of the small council of plotters that was known as the Revolutionary Council.
1971 was the year the government of President Jomo Kenyatta had to deal with its first and only serious threat from the country's armed forces. It came shortly after President Milton Obote in neighboring Uganda had been overthrown in a military coup by General Idi Amin in January.
Well, the Chief Justice Kitili Mwendwa was said to be the man to swear in the Army General Joseph Ndolo after taking power from Kenyatta and his fellow Kikuyus. At the National Assembly in Nairobi, the member for Githunguri, Arthur Magogo, wanted the MPs to be informed on the extent of Chief Justice Kitili Mwendwa's involvement in these coup plotting allegations. A fiery debate ensued in Parliament, with some advocating for the Chief Justice to be fired, but Mwendwa's own brother, a man known as Ngala Kitili, who was Labour Minister for Kenyatta, continued to defend him and vouch for him to the very end. Just after the debate in Parliament had come to an end, the crowds hired by Jomo Kenyatta's politicians continued to stage demonstrations and protest agitating for Chief Justice Kitili Mwendwa to be removed from the office of Chief Justice for backbiting Jomo Kenyatta. Eventually, Chief Justice Mwendwa resigned from office on the 7th of July, 1971. By this point, the Akamba majority in the Kenyan military had already been diluted by the increasing numbers of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru peoples who were slowly taking places that they had previously been banned by the British from taking in the military. In spite of his alleged role in the 1971 coup plot, the leadership of Major General Joseph Ndolo as the first black chief of defense staff was widely accepted among the soldiers of Kenya, and a majority of them were willing to die to defend him had Kenyatta decided to arrest him back then. Even after he had resigned on Jomo Kenyatta's orders, the name of Major General Ndolo would linger in the lips of many even outside his own Akamba community. After Ndolo left, Jackson Mulinge took the reins of Kenya's military leadership. This was the man who would be the longest-serving chief of defense staff yet. Evidence presented in court suggested three possible ways through which the 1971 coup plot was betrayed and discovered. The Yatta MP Gideon Mutiso, being among the masterminds arraigned in court, would admit that he had showed the declaration speech they had written to another MP inside Parliament building and told him that this was a speech meant for Major Ndolo to read after the coup. A second possible reason the plot was exposed is said to be through intelligence reports reaching Jomo Kenyatta's office from Kampala, Uganda and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where that plot had been schemed and coordinated with other Kenyans who we discover up ahead and were living over there. Before everything had gone haywire, Major General Ndolo was reported to have hosted 12 secret meetings where he would slaughter goats and invite others to discuss the coup attempts at his home. The meetings were confirmed to have happened in Ndolo's own home compound in Sultan Ahmud, Makueni County. Apart from the general himself, the others on the list of the coup plotters included the Yatta MP, Mutiso, who had been initiated into the planning committee by Ndolo himself at a state function to receive President Joseph Tito of what was then known as Soviet nation of Yugoslavia, which was held at the Kenyan Parliament buildings. The other man on that list was Daniel Owino, a Luo man who was accused of being second in command after Ndolo had they succeeded in their endeavor to change the regime. It's notable that Joseph Daniel Owino was also among the 11th Battalion soldiers who had staged that mutiny in Lanet Barracks back in the day in 1964. Surprisingly enough, Daniel Owino had been sentenced to serve 7 years in prison at the court-martial that had followed the 1964 incident, but somehow he would later move to Dar es Salaam, where he was with his colleague Professor Ouma Muga at the time of the 1971 coup plot allegations. All the other 11 accused persons would unanimously point at Daniel Owino as the major mastermind coordinating the whole coup plot from the base in the city of Dar, Tanzania. It would later come to light that Daniel Owino was not very well educated, having joined the army as a younger person back when it was still King's African Rifles. During the proceedings of the case against the coup plotters in Nairobi, the presiding judge, again Mr. S.K. Sachdeva, would be quoted to have wondered out loud, asking how it was possible that someone with an education as little as that of Daniel Owino could persuade and even lead and coordinate people of such caliber as General Ndolo, CJ Kitili Mwendwa, and even Professor Ouma through such a risky adventure. Joseph Daniel Owino was sentenced to 9.5 years in a maximum security prison. As for the others, despite writing a repentant letter asking President Jomo Kenyatta for mercy, Yatta MP Gideon Mutiso too got 9.5 years in a similar prison. Ben Oumamuga was a geography professor who taught at Makerere University in Uganda, and he too was a major suspect in the case. He would get sentenced to 8 years in prison for coordinating from outside the country in the conspiracy to depose Jomo Kenyatta. Notably, Professor Muga Ouma was once an elected member of parliament for the Rangwe constituency. The other co-conspirators were military soldiers with names from various major communities in Kenya, and they were all handed varying sentences of between 7 and 9 years. After the 1971 coup attempt prosecutions, Major General Jackson Mulinge would officially start serving his term as the Chief of Defense Staff, but Jomo Kenyatta would drastically reduce his powers in the state military operations by putting him on a short leash held by Njoroge Mungai, Jomo Kenyatta's doctor cousin, who had remained a recurring theme in this entire period of Kenyan history.
And Kenya government is not going to surrender an inch.
Under this new arrangement, the previously huge numbers of young Kamba and Luo men who would get easy draft into the army came to drop even more drastically, all while Mount Kenya young people, especially from Mzee Kenyatta's own backyard, continued to dominate the new recruitments and promotions roster. When Jomo Kenyatta dies and the new president gets sworn into office in 1979, the wheel of tribal competition and superiority would take yet another turn, and this time it would be young men and officers from Daniel Moi's Kalenjin community that got preferential access to KDF recruitment and promotions for a long time. President Daniel Arap Moi would prefer to have his own trusted homeboys at strategic positions in the army, necessitated by fear of being overthrown by other tribes, a fear that Kenyatta had lived with and he, Moi, would come to face and deal with in August 1982.
Mimi nikiwa amiri jeshi la majeshi yetu ya Kenya.
The military coup attempt of 1982 was planned and plotted to happen while most soldiers of the Kenya Defence Forces KDF were in the remote town of Lodwar attending the International Military War Games sporting event that was happening that year. At about 3 a.m. in the morning of Sunday, 1st of August 1982, a group of KDF soldiers of the Kenya Air Force Wing would suddenly out of nowhere pick up their weapons and hold their bosses hostage at the Isli Air Base in Nairobi. They declared that they were going to overthrow the government. By 4 a.m., another air base located in the same city was also taken hostage by the same group of soldiers. This was the Embakasi Air Base located near the international airport. At 6 in the morning, Senior Private Hezekiah Ochuka and his colleague Sergeant Pankrasoteo Okumu would take control of the country's only radio station at the time, Voice of Kenya, and they even went to the home of legendary radio announcer late Leonard Mambo Mbotela and forced Mbotela to come with them to announce on live broadcast that the government of Daniel Moi had been overthrown by the Kenya Defence Forces. After that, Senior Private Ochuka himself would be heard over the radio declaring that every police officer in Kenya was now a civilian citizen.
This is the Voice of Kenya, Nairobi. Time now is 12 minutes past 6. You are hereby informed that everybody is requested to stay at home. There should be no movement in town. The government has now been taken by the military until further notice. There should be no movement of persons or vehicles from one place to another. The police should now assume the role of civilian until further notice.
At the same time, when all this is going on, another different soldier of the Air Force who was part of this plot, known as Corporal Bramwell Njereman, was leading another faction of this group, which was planning to use bombs to blow up the Nairobi State House, and another target of theirs was the main Air Force headquarters located in Nanyuki, Laikipia County. Corporal Njereman, it is reported, would force 3 high-ranking military pilots to fly real explosives in 3 KDF fighter jets, aiming to attack his targets in the same August 1st morning when his colleagues were wreaking havoc in the air bases in Nairobi. The pilots on Corporal Njereman's command were Major David Mutua, Captain John Mugwana, and Captain John Baraza, and they all accepted to fly the jet fighters under alleged duress by the junior officer. Things fell apart when the KDF pilots would silently scheme to betray Njereman once they were airborne and refused to do what he wanted them to do regarding State House and the Nanyuki Air Base. Major David Mutua would be the one to leak the coup plot and Njereman's plan to his military superiors and then influence his colleagues to drop the explosives they were carrying on the peaks of Mount Kenya instead of where the coup plotters wanted them dropped. They then flew back to the Nanyuki Air Base without Njereman. Because at that time, many KDF soldiers and officers, including Major General Mulinge, were attending the war games in Lodwar. Those few high-ranking officers left on duty back in Nairobi were forced to deal with the coup situations by themselves. Lieutenant General John Sawe and his deputy, a man known as Mahmoud Mohammed, would be joined by 2 other senior officers to form an emergency war council for the KDF. Between them, it was decided that Major Mohammed Mahmoud would take charge of the operation to resist and extinguish the coup attempt, and quickly an elite squad of KDF soldiers was put together from Kahawa Barracks and from the 1st Kenya Rifles Battalion, ready to commence the operation to save the regime from Ochuka and his men. While all this was happening, Daniel Moi's biographer Andrew Morton, writing his 1995 biography, that the president had been hidden in a bush by his presidential security because Moi had already given up on regaining control of the country from those soldiers. Back in Nairobi, the squad of 30 KDF operatives headed by Mohammed Mahmoud would lay siege and ambush the Voice of Kenya studios in Nairobi, killing some of Ochuka's Air Force men who they found keeping watch over there before bursting into the broadcasting house itself, where Leonard Mambo Mbotela was sitting shaking with fear. General Mahmoud would then instruct Leonard Mambo Mbotela to get back on air and announce to the nation that the coup attempt had been crushed and thwarted and Moi's government was still in charge and the plotters had been captured.
Nataka niseme kwamba yale yaliyotokea leo asubuhi kwa muda mfupi iliyoletea wananchi wasiwasi mwingi sasa imeangamizwa na jeshi letu la nchi kavu na polisi, na nawashukuru wao sana kwa juhudi zao za kuangamiza hao maharamia.
On realizing that his plan had taken a wrong turn, Hezekiah Ochuka would take a plane by himself and fly to neighboring Tanzania, even after he had sworn himself in as Kenya's president for 6 hours during the coup. But then in Tanzania, Ochuka and his counterparts would be arrested by the country's authorities and handed back over to the government of Kenya, where they would be sentenced to death by hanging for the crimes of high treason. 100 soldiers from the Kenya Air Force would be shot dead trying to overthrow the regime on that day, while the number of civilian casualties is said to be over 200 people. Hezekiah Ochuka had the second lowest rank in the KDF military hierarchy, a senior private, and it would come to be said that he was working in collaboration with top-ranking politicians such as Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and his own son Raila Amolo Odinga.
Have you ever wondered why Raila was not hanged and Ochuka was? Ochuka was simply a senior private in the army, in the Air Force, right? So who could have been the leader of that movement? A private in the army or Raila Odinga, the son of Jaramogi? Who had the money to fund the coup? Ochuka private was earning less than 10,000 shillings. Could actually do a coup? Have you guys wondered? But he was hanged. Wow. Uriwa Hongo was hanged. Ogido Bon was hanged. Many others. Junior officers were hanged. Raila Odinga survived. How? Ask yourself. How was Raila saved? What saved him? Because he betrayed his comrade.
The conspiracy to overthrow Daniel Moi's regime had been plotted for many years and weeks, but what's most astonishing is that military generals and government intelligence services in Moi's circles had already been warned of this scheme, but they hesitated to act before it had happened. James Kanyotu, who had been the chief spy at the National Intelligence Service (NIS) at the time, would be quoted requesting President Daniel Moi openly at a public function in Nyeri to allow him to arrest those he knew to have been planning the coup d'etat, but that being on a weekend, Moi would refuse, telling the NIS boss to wait until the following Monday. The day on which Kanyotu made his bizarre request to Daniel Moi had been on a Friday on the 30th of July 1982, only 2 days before the Sunday morning coup attempt on the 1st of August. Kanyotu and President Moi had been attending the ongoing agricultural show of Kenya in Nyeri district that Friday. The attempt by Hezekiah Ochuka and other Air Force men to overthrow Daniel Moi failed for several reasons, top among them being lack of proper planning by those who executed the coup attempt. For example, the rebel soldiers who were supposed to arrest President Moi and his cabinet ministers after the coup had been announced on the VOK radio would instead start drinking liquor and go on a looting spree in the streets of Nairobi, completely forgetting the role they had been delegated to play next. Instead of coordinating his fellow mutineers to do as they had previously planned, Ochuka himself would waste some precious time when he decided to go to broadcaster Leonard Mambo Botela's house and bring him out to announce the coup by himself. Further, since they did not have the support of many other major arms of the Kenya Defense Forces, the Ochuka men did not expect the early morning attack by the special squad led by Major General Mohammed Mahmoud while holding fort inside the broadcasting house in Nairobi. All the suspects in this coup attempt were tried and sentenced in court-martial, which was held at the Kenyatta Military Barracks in Nairobi. In addition to Hezekiah Ochuka, a total of 12 KDF soldiers were sent to the gallows, while a whopping 600 other soldiers were sent to prison. The 12 convicts with a death sentence would face the hangman on the night of 10th July 1985, and their bodies were buried that same night inside the Kamiti Maximum Security Prison. After these events, President Daniel Moi instructed for the Kenya Air Force to be disbanded with immediate effect. A new Air Force outfit known as the 82 Air Force was put together to replace them, and their slogan would also change from Twatumikia Tukiwa Angani to become Tuko Imara Angani, meaning we are firm in the sky. The soldiers who made up the new 82 Air Force outfit were drawn from the Kenya Army and from the remnants of the previous Air Force group. Even further, the Ministry of Defense would also introduce regulations that gave the Kenyan Navy much more powers over their counterparts in the 82 Air Force. The newly formed 82 Air Force was not recognized under the Constitution of Kenya as one of the three major arms of the Kenya military forces. Therefore, as it would come to be realized later, the newly formed 82 Air Force was not recognized under the Constitution of Kenya as one of the three major arms of the Kenya military forces, and therefore the Air Force arm of the KDF would remain without any significant jurisdiction until there came one event of 1993, which would finally restore the Kenya Air Force to its former glory. In a case prosecuted at the court-martial, an Air Force officer known as Captain Geoffrey Murugi was charged with stealing money from the military during his 10 years as the paymaster in charge of salaries at the Moi Air Base Camp in Nairobi. The man deciding this court-martial case happened to be the commander of the 82 Air Force at the time, one Major General Duncan Wachira. Captain Murugi was accused of stealing the money 10 years earlier, and this case had been ongoing since March 1983. And therefore the accused officer in his defense argued that it was not possible to charge him afresh under the laws of Kenya Armed Forces simply because he was serving under the 82 Air Force, which was still not legally gazetted as a proper arm of the Kenya military, and back when he was accused of the crime, the original Kenya Air Force had not yet been disbanded by President Daniel Moi. Murugi won that case, and when he was charged again for the same crime by a different prosecutor, he would end up taking his case to the Court of Appeal back then, which was the High Court of Kenya. In this case, the High Court judgment declared that the original Air Force that Moi had disbanded after August 1982 was still effective under the Constitution of Kenya, and that 82 Air Force was nothing but a decorative name for the same old outfit. Immediately following this landmark ruling of 1993, the Kenya Air Force would get their full funding and jurisdiction that had been suspended since 1982. From the year 1989, soldiers from the KDF would start getting invited to international peacekeeping missions coordinated by the United Nations across the world.
When war is declared, this man knows exactly what to carry.
In In the same year of 1999, female soldiers in the KDF would finally be fully integrated into the normal military ranks, and the Women's Service Corps formed back in 1971 was permanently disbanded, being just one example of the sweeping military reforms introduced by celebrated Kalenjin KDF boss General Tonje, who we discuss in detail towards the end of this video. Opportunities to serve abroad in peacekeeping missions would expand the income of the KDF soldiers selected to go on those missions. When the Kenya Defense Forces went into neighboring Somalia to fight the Al-Shabaab under Mwai Kibaki's Operation Linda Nchi in the year 2011, the eyes of many Kenyans were fixed on the KDF soldiers for a long time, both on the media and even in the national public discourse.
To Kismayu was diverted to Al-Ade, and it's the first one that reported the camp was on fire but could not approach further as the assailants had deployed 2 anti-aircraft guns near the camp.
The safest option was to send in ground troops.
Eventually, most Kenyan troops would leave Somalia, but since the year 2011, limited numbers of KDF soldiers have remained on duty inside Somalia as part of the larger peacekeeping mission known as the Africa Union Mission to Somalia, abbreviated as AMISOM. A British magazine called The Economist would publish a shocking report in the year 2015 claiming that the Kenya Defense Forces troops based in Somalia at the time were involved in illegal trafficking of sugar in partnership with the Al-Shabaab militias. The article by The Economist would claim that Kenyan KDF soldiers of every rank would collaborate with Al-Shabaab to transport duty-free sugar from the port of Kismayo and bring it to Kenya through shortcuts while making as much as $30 million every year from the sugar smuggling business. It is said that much of the money made in this business came from the soldiers charging exorbitant fees to allow safe passage to the illegal sugar smugglers to come into the Kenyan market through the porous northeastern border. In 2016, the year after the expose by The Economist, Kenya's own daily newspaper, The Daily Nation, would publish a second article, this time claiming that on top of sugar, the Kenya Defense Forces soldiers in Somalia were now smuggling illegal charcoal from Somalia into Kenya to be sold at cheap prices to homesteads and local businesses. The report said that by charging exaggerated smuggling fees to charcoal transporters at the border, the stakeholders and soldiers in the military would make amounts of up to 1.2 billion Kenya shillings every year. The Daily Nation investigations were further supported by a special United Nations task force that monitored the military conduct of AMISOM forces inside Somalia and said the allegations were true. The KDF and the Kenyan government would of course deny any such activities amongst their soldiers. And finally, these here are the notable achievements of the various KDF generals who have served since the independence of Kenya.
7 days after General Jackson Kimeu Mulinge's death, friends and family gathered at his home in Kuluni village in Machakos County.
General Jackson Mulinge, who came in after the first CDF Joseph Ndolo, ended up serving for 13 whole years as Chief of Defense Staff, and he became the first Kenyan soldier to be given the rank of a 4-star general in the year 1980. Mulinge's entire military training had been done based on the British military program, which was famous for being rigorous and thorough, and he was widely believed to be amongst the finest soldiers to ever serve in the military of Kenya. Upon his retirement from the Kenya Defense Forces, Major General Mulinge went into politics, and he was very successful there too, getting elected as the MP for Kathiani and later serving as Minister for Lands and Minister for Health. After Jackson Mulinge, then came Major General Mohammed Mahmoud, the hero who had extinguished the 1982 coup attempt with a squad of 30 elite soldiers. Mohammed Mahmoud was appointed as the Chief of Defense Staff in the year 1986, and he would serve up to his retirement 10 years later in 1996. Mahmoud had started with very little formal education compared to others of his level, and his rise from being a junior army private to becoming the Chief of Defense Forces was unprecedented in Kenyan military record. After Mahmoud had left, what followed was the era of a very famous military general known as Daudi Tonje. Major General Daudi Tonje took charge of the Kenya Defense Forces after the retirement of Mohammed Mahmoud in 1996. Under General Tonje's leadership, many sweeping changes were made in the KDF, including inclusion of women in the military operations and the abolishment of the Kenyatta-era Special Women's Service Corps. Major General Daudi Tonje also introduced laws that reduced how long a soldier of the KDF was expected to serve before retirement. Under the famous Tonje Rules, top-ranking KDF officers would retire after serving 4 years in the appointed senior positions or after attaining the age of 62, depending on which milestone came first. Another one of famous Tonje Rules said that every one of the major arms of the military would henceforth get a rotating turn to produce the chief of all defense staff, going from Army, Air Force, Navy, and then coming back to the beginning. Not just that, Major General Daudi Tonje would also place a ban on the tradition of soldiers queuing in front of office windows to get their salaries, and he directed that all KDF soldiers were to be paid in their individual bank accounts.
Every 14 days they would go on, there was a pay parade. People would go to receive their money on the table. And in the evening everything goes to the bar. So I said, Abana, this is not on. Let these fellows get paid like everybody else. Besides, they should also buy their food. So whatever was given as ration, I added to their salary. I opened up that people should be able to stay outside, opened up more places for house allowances so that people can live their lives. There was never enough married quarters, so let them go outside. So my soldiers for the first time got salary in their bank. So that was the biggest, they like me up to today. 20 years later, they still like me.
When he finally retired in the year 2000, President Daniel Moi would beg General Daudi Tonje to serve a little bit longer as the KDF boss, but the general refused and insisted on enjoying his retirement. After Tonje, the new CDF was Joseph Kibwana, who was the chief of defense at the time when Daniel Moi was handing over Kenya's presidency to Mwai Kibaki after 24 years of the Nyayo regime. General Kibwana had been the head of the Kenya Navy before he inherited Daudi Tonje as CDF. When it was his turn to retire in 2005, General Kibwana handed the baton to Jeremiah Kianga, the next general to head the armed forces. Jeremiah Kianga was a very strict and well-disciplined soldier who introduced the requirement for all senior military officers in the KDF to have at least a diploma certificate in military science. Once the tribal clashes had begun following the December 2007 contested presidential elections, President Mwai Kibaki delayed the retirement of Major General Jeremiah Kianga for 1.5 years. Kianga would retire in 2011, and then he handed the mantle to Julius Karangi, the general who would lead the Kenya Defense Forces to invade and occupy parts of neighboring Somalia under the Operation Linda Nchi. On top of his military expertise in the war against the Al-Shabaab, General Karangi was a man with significant political influence and connections inside President Kibaki's administration as well as the subsequent Uhuru Kenyatta administration. Julius Karangi would retire from the top of the KDF in the year 2015, and he was succeeded by General Samson Jeffo Mwathethe, who would serve his term as Chief of Defense Staff until when he left in May 2020. General Robert Kariuki Kiboshi took over and served for just 3 years before retiring, since he had attained the age of 62 before serving out his full term as CDS. The late Francis Omondi Ogolla would inherit Kiboshi to become Kenya's military boss in 2023, despite General Ogolla seemingly having political differences with the new president, William Samoei Ruto.
Before I invite Your Excellency, I want to make an apology, Your Excellency.
President Ruto would be quoted complaining on the media that KDF General Francis Ogolla had participated in a scheme to try and overturn his election victory at the Bomas of Kenya back in August 2022.
I appointed General Ogolla. General Ogolla is among the people who went to Bomas to try and overturn my victory. Do you know that?
General Francis Ogolla died in April 2024 in a fatal helicopter crash while he was traveling to a function in Western Kenya. Francis Ogolla became the first Kenyan military leader to die in office. The vacant CDF seat was given to Charles Morio Kahariri starting 18th of April 2024.